Hello again, everyone. Let's talk Hobbes. I took a look at the Salon. I thought that went very well. What I want to do in this video is to try to highlight some main points in the text in the hopes that I'll be able to draw together some of your Salon comments, in hopes that I'll be able to answer some of your questions and just give you some guiding threads through this text. Of course, if I don't get to your questions in this video, there are going to be mechanisms for you to let me know that, and I will answer them in other ways. But let's see what we can do. Now, the first thing I want to mention, and the first thing I think is important in reading Hobbes, is to recognize something about his method. Hobbes is oftentimes called a kind of mechanical philosopher. And what we mean by a mechanical philosopher is somebody who is very much aware of and very much indebted to the new mechanical science of the 17th century. And all I mean by mechanical science is the application of mathematics to nature. This is the kind of stuff that Galileo is doing, and using mathematical formulas to study bodies in motion. And that's really what mechanics is about. We're going to use mathematics to study the motion of natural bodies. Many of you noted that at the beginning of chapter 2, Hobbes gives us a version of the principle of inertia. This is a principle he gets from Galileo, noting that when a thing lies still, it will lie still unless acted upon by an outside force, and when in motion, it will stay in motion unless acted on again by an outside force. So here we see a very clear example early on in the text of Hobbes aligning himself with this kind of mechanical thinking. Another really important aspect of Hobbes' philosophy, or his method, that I think he gets from looking at mechanics is his understanding of what it means to know something. And I'm going here to page 30, where Hobbes says, because when we see how anything comes about, upon what causes, and by what manner, when the like causes come into power, we see how to make it produce the like effects. To know something for Hobbes is to know how to generate it. And if you're a mechanic, you know how to build something from the ground up. We know the causes that make things happen. We know we know how to generate things, right? We know how to bring things about. If we know the causes, we can bring about the effects. So here we have Hobbes in the Leviathan trying to account for various things that have to do with the rise of ethics, politics, societies. And so he's going to start from the ground up and see how we can generate these things using a broadly mechanical mindset. And so Hobbes, from this beginning, uses these kinds of principles to explain mankind, right? He uses them to explain sense, sensation. What is sensation for Hobbes? It is one body impressing on another body, right? It is some sort of force impressing on my sense organs, whether that be light on the eyes or some rudimentary conceptions Hobbes might have of sound waves impressing on the ears. This is, again, bodies in motion. This is contact. And sensation for Hobbes is the origin of all of our ideas. As many of you mentioned, not that we can access everything in the world as it is in itself, because we have to account for the fact that our sense organs attribute or contribute some of the motion that goes into our having a sensation. It is the outside force interacting with the force of my eye or my ear or my skin. But this is a very naturalistic, materialistic account of sensation. Hobbes goes on to describe imagination in the same way. And I think there was a bit of a confusion here about what Hobbes means by imagination, and I think it's understandable. We tend to think of imagination as being kind of, this is where my mind runs free. This is where I get to daydream or envision things. And that's included in Hobbes's understanding of imagination. But in the 17th century, imagination refers more broadly to our faculty of images, right? It's our ability to picture things. It's our ability to form images in our mind. So imagination and memory then are linked for Hobbes in a way they might not be for us. So you have an initial sensation, it furnishes you with an idea, and then later on, you can recall that image in memory, or you can recall that image for your daydreaming or something like this. All of this is imagination for Hobbes. But importantly, this is still explained by mechanical, naturalistic, material principles. For Hobbes, we have a sensation in our sense organs, and our brains are able to retain that motion somehow. It's a kind of reverberation of the original impact or the original impression. So it's weaker, and it weakens over time as that original impression kind of reverberates in our brains. And now Hobbes also uses this naturalistic starting point to offer accounts of things like dreams, visions, apparitions, and Hobbes thinks this is really important. And he makes one especially telling line, I think, for our purposes early on in the text. This is in chapter 2, where he says, if superstitious fear of spirits were taken away, and with it prognostics from dreams, false prophecies, and many other things depending thereon, by which crafty, ambitious persons abuse the simple people, men would be much more fitted than they are for civil obedience. So Hobbes thinks that if we can give more natural accounts of things like dreams, of perhaps visions we would have, people would be less apt to be taken advantage of by ambitious preachers or other ambitious people who might try to mislead people about what their dreams mean, what the apparitions mean. And if we could have this more grounded account, we would be better suited for life in a civil commonwealth and in civil society. So this is really important for Hobbes, and we'll see this in next week's reading. So you'll want to keep an eye on the link between superstition, Hobbes' account of reason, and what kinds of civil freedoms there are for religion and for individuals in his commonwealth. One last point on the early going before turning to Hobbes' conception of reason. Hobbes' insistence that all of our ideas begin with our sense impressions puts important constraints on the kinds of words and concepts we can use in our thinking. And there's a helpful illustration of this. Here I am on page 18 going to 19, where Hobbes starts talking about the infinite. He says, whatsoever we imagine is finite, right? Anything we can picture is of finite magnitude. It's not of infinite magnitude, and it's not of infinite time. So whatsoever we imagine is finite. Therefore, there is no idea or conception of anything we call infinite. No man can have in his mind an image of an infinite magnitude, nor conceive infinite swiftness, time, force, power. When we say anything is infinite, we signify only that we are not able to conceive the ends and bounds of the thing named, having no conception of the thing, but of our own inability. So when I say something is infinite, I'm not saying something about that object. I'm saying something about my own inability to adequately picture it in thought. And therefore the name God is used not to make us conceive him, for he himself is incomprehensible, and his greatness and power are unconceivable, but that we may honor him. Right? So the use of the name God is useful in worship, but it's not because we can really conceive of God. Also because whatsoever, as I said before, we conceive has been first perceived by sense, either all at once or by parts. A man can have no thought representing anything not subject to sense. We can't really have a true thought or a true concept of anything that does not somehow relate back to our sense experience. No man, therefore, can conceive anything, but he must conceive it in some place, and endured with some determinate magnitude, and which may be divided into parts. Nor that anything is all in this place and all in another place at the same time, nor that two or more things can be in one and the same place at once. This is actually a critique of the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, which would say that the Eucharist over here and the Eucharist over here are both Christ. Hobbes would say this is inconceivable, right? You can't have something that is in two places at once, all at once. For none of these things, quoting Hobbes again, ever have or can be incident to sense, but are absurd speeches taken upon credit without any signification at all, from deceived philosophers. Anything that can't be traced back to sense for Hobbes is nonsense. It's an unclear concept. It is confused speech. It's like saying square circle. So that's important for Hobbes. So he's not here. You'll note very carefully. He's not saying we can't talk about God, but we have to note the limitations of what we mean when we use a phrase like God. So again, important constraints here on what kinds of concepts we can use in our reasoning. Hobbes discusses reason in chapter 5, and there were several questions on the salon about Hobbes's comparison between reasoning and addition and subtraction. Hobbes is very famous for saying that reason is nothing but reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting of the consequence of general names agreed upon for the marking and signifying of our thoughts. And even in the foregoing there, he discusses reasoning as a kind of addition and subtraction. What Hobbes has in mind here, and he makes this comparison explicitly on the next page, is what we oftentimes refer to as the geometric method. If you remember geometry, how do you proceed in geometric proofs? Well, you first offer a very simple, clear definition of the simplest item, and then you build up from there. So you define a point, and then what's a line is a series of points. And what's a plane? It's a series of lines. And so you have a chain of interlocking definitions that allows you to see very clearly how you've proceeded from the base level to more complex things, because again, you have interlocking definitions where point is part of the definition of line and line is part of the definition of plane, and all your terms are very clearly spelled out, and all your connections between terms are very evident. This, for Hobbes, is what it means for us to reason, or at least reason well. What we're doing when we're reasoning is trying to find these connections between concepts and build one upon another. And this explains a lot of how this work is written. You'll notice Hobbes giving very many definitions and trying to show how one thing follows from the next, how one faculty of the mind arises from what came before it. I think it was Kyle who in the salon later in the text says, it feels like it took us forever to get here. Yes, exactly. That's the point. Because every step has to be very clearly justified. The way a geometer would do his or her proofs, the way a mathematician would show work for her formulas. And again, this links to the mechanical idea of generation. Right, we're going to build things from the ground up, and we're going to be very certain, that the bolts are tightened at each point. And this is for Hobbes what reason and science strive for. And if he's doing a project in the Leviathan where he wants to make politics a science, then he has to build it again up from a conception of humankind. Next, I'd like to talk about Hobbes's account of the passions, or what we might call his moral psychology. And I think there are two things that are really helpful for understanding where Hobbes is coming from. The first is his discussion of desire and appetite, which begins with a discussion of endeavor. Now, endeavor is in Latin conatus. It's the Latin term Hobbes uses, which means a kind of striving. And endeavor for Hobbes is like the tiniest unit of motion. And Hobbes says before we observe any motion, there are these tiny endeavors within any body, which are leading it to move towards or move away from certain objects or to behave in a certain way. And these aren't perceptible, but we need small beginnings of motion to account for more complex motions. And Hobbes says, this is page 32, endeavor when it is towards something is called appetite. And when it's away from something, it's called aversion. Right? So we have all these small appetites, these desires, these aversions within us, and their interaction ultimately determines what we do or don't do. But Hobbes makes a very important comment 2 pages later, where he says this motion, which is called appetite, seems to be a corroboration of vital motion and a help thereunto. Let me translate this for you a little bit. This is Hobbes saying in so many words that our kind of fundamental endeavor, our fundamental striving is to persist in being. is to assist our vital motion, our motion of life, right? Our fundamental striving is a striving to persist in being. This again is a kind of mechanical principle. This is a psychological rendering of the principle of inertia. Something in motion wants to stay in motion. Something in being wants to persist in being. You can take my water bottle here, right? I didn't expect that to happen, but it exerts a certain resistance against my pressure on it, right? It's striving to persist in being. And if I'm more powerful than it won't. And if it's more powerful than me, it will. But importantly, everything is striving to persist in being. And Hobbes sees this as a kind of mechanical principle that all things in the world follow. So I think that's one really important point. The second one, and here I am going to page 60. And here I'm at the beginning of chapter 11, which is pretty important, where he talks about manners. And here Hobbes is talking about what happiness is for us. And he says, the felicity of this life consists not in the repose of a mind satisfied. Right? To be happy is not to just sort of have your mind satisfied. For there is no such utmost aim. There's no finis ultimus, the kind of ultimate goal or ultimate end. Nor is there a highest good, a summum bonum, as is spoken of in many of the books of moral philosophers. Nor can a man any more live whose desires are at an end than he whose senses and imaginations are at a stand. We can't live without having these endeavors, without having this striving to persist in being. And when we're in this life, there's no end to that. Right? There's no highest good. There's no point at which we can say, I don't desire anything anymore, or I have no more appetites. Felicity, therefore, happiness, is not the end of desire. It's not the satisfaction of desire. It is a continual progress of desire, one desire to the next, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. The cause of this is that man's desire is not just to enjoy only once and for one instance of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. And let me pause here and not read at you. I think this is really important. One of the things that makes humans unique for Hobbes is that we can project ourselves into the future. Hobbes talks a lot about curiosity, and at one point he says that our curiosity to figure out causes and effects, to figure out why things happen the way they do, has its origin in anxiety for the future. Right? We want to be able to plan for our future. It's not good enough to have my desire satisfied now. I want to be able to know or to guarantee as much as I can the continued enjoyment of that desire. Right? I don't want to just live now and be happy now. I'm already thinking about the future and what's it going to take for me to procure my desires and my happiness and my felicity in the future. Right? So we project ourselves into the future. This causes us to study, right? To seek out the causes of things, the effects of things, to be able to plan. But this is why Hobbes says, and this is something often misunderstood, that in the first place, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. Power after power. Now, some people struggle with that, but I think it's important to go back and see what does Hobbes mean by power. And here at the beginning of chapter 10, Hobbes says that power is your means to obtain some apparent good. Right? Power is your ability to attain some good, and again, most basically, your ability to persist in being and have the power to persist in being. And Hobbes goes through a list of all the things. I mean, chapter 10 is kind of amazing. It's long, but it's amazing. Of all the things that would count for us as power, things that help us achieve the goods that we want to achieve. So we have this desire to persist in being. We can project into the future, and we want to attain our desires. Hobbes says that means we have to desire power after power. We can never be secure. You can never just say, I'm good. I don't have any need for desire anymore. I no longer have need for power. because to stop desiring or to stop having these endeavors is to stop being alive. Now, does this make Hobbes pessimistic? Some people read the power after power line as a kind of pessimism that Hobbes has, that we're going to naturally be these kinds of ambitious, power-hungry people. And that's an open question, but let me give you a version of what I think Hobbes would say. Hobbes remarks in the Leviathan that we're not naturally cruel. He doesn't think we would ever do anything nasty to somebody else if it didn't serve our own interests. So there's no kind of natural sadism here. But yet Hobbes would also say, look, this desire for power after power, this desire to persist in being and to secure that for the future, again, this is a kind of natural principle. This is the principle of inertia translated into human psychology. And if you want to say that maybe we're naturally cooperative or we're naturally altruistic, you need to justify where that comes from, right? You need to explain where that comes from. And many people after Hobbes try this. But I think for Hobbes, he wants to start with the most basic, undeniable, simplest principle and go from there. And he says the simplest principle is this desire to persist in being. This desire for power after power, and if there's something else about our psychology that's altruistic or cooperative, we're going to have to generate that by a series of demonstrations and interlocking definitions. Now, I do want to note that some scholars don't want to let Hobbes off the hook so easy. Hobbes presents himself as, again, giving a kind of naturalistic, mechanical account of human beings. And some scholars want to say, oh, hold on here. It's one thing to say natural bodies abide by the principle of inertia. It's quite a different move to make this the foundation of human psychology. So that while Hobbes presents himself as a kind of naturalist here, some scholars want to say what he's really doing here is just kind of giving his own account of what human beings are like. If you recall in the preface, Hobbes encourages people, to look inside themselves, to look at their own passions, and to from there ascertain what the passions of human beings are. And some people think that this is really what Hobbes is doing here. This is Hobbes's account of humanity more than it is him being a kind of strict naturalist. So I put that out there. You can think about that. But again, if I were to be sympathetic to Hobbes or to try to give a defense of Hobbes, I think you would say, okay, even if this is a jump going from natural bodies to human psychology, at least I'm starting from the simplest principles. And it's much more questionable whether or not altruism is at our heart than it is to say that some sort of concern for self-preservation is at the heart of our psychology. So let's just start with the simplest thing and see what we can build up from there. Last issue before the notorious chapter 13 is Hobbes' account of the will. Hobbes is not a believer in free will. If by free will you mean that you can simply choose kind of what you do out of nowhere, that you have some sort of radically free act, Hobbes defines the will as the last appetite in a deliberation, or the last aversion. Right, so you're deliberating what to do, you have these different desires and aversions running through your mind, pulling you in different directions. Whatever that last one is, the one that immediately precedes your action, that's your will. Right? The will, all we mean by will is sort of the outcome of a process of deliberation. And what Hobbes is really saying here is don't think that you can deliberate one way and that your desires are going to lead you in a certain way, and then you can just choose to do the opposite thing, that you're radically free. No, in some ways we are determined by these processes of deliberation. What freedom means for Hobbes is simply lack of impediment. And he gets to this on page 79, later in the text, when he defines liberty. And I'm at the bottom of the page here. He says, by liberty is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments. That's all it means to be free. So if my will is to take a drink, if nothing is impeding me, I'm free. If something were impeding me, I'm not free. Um, but this differs for Hobbes from some accounts of free will, which make it seem as if my desires could ultimately be pointing in one direction and that I could do something else. For Hobbes, this is confused language. If you want to know what my will was, it was my last appetite before acting. So my will in this case was to lift my bottle and take a drink. Um, Keep this in mind as we go forward as to Hobbes's conception of liberty and freedom, because I think it will be important in discussing political freedoms when we get there next week. The most widely read chapter of the Leviathan is chapter 13, in which Hobbes offers a kind of hypothetical thought experiment which considers the natural condition of mankind. Given what we know about human nature, given what we've derived thus far, what would be our natural condition? And Hobbes makes a number of remarkable claims. The first is that by nature we are equal. There is no natural political structure. There is no natural authority of one person over another. And Hobbes memorably justifies this equality by saying we're all equally vulnerable to being killed. Even if you're stronger than me, and you might think you can't kill me, you have to sleep. Or I could band with other people and we could gang up against you. Why is death important here? Remember the importance of persisting in being. So we're all equally vulnerable. There's no natural authority. And Hobbes says, because of this, there are going to be quarrels in our natural state. And there are three causes of quarrel that Hobbes discusses. The first is that we're going to compete for resources. We're equal. Nobody has a natural right to anything over me, and we are equal in the hopes of attaining what we want, and we may fight for competition. The second cause of quarrel Hobbes gives is what he calls diffidence. Central here is a concern for security. I might invade you so that you don't strike first. You might start a fight with me so that I don't become too powerful. Hobbes talks about this in different ways, but the central concern with diffidence is security. And then finally, Hobbes says there may be quarrel for the sake of glory, for the sake of reputation. Hobbes says that having a reputation for power is itself a power. Again, because people might want to be in league with you and not your enemy, and that helps you persist in being, helps you attain your desires. I ask more about this passion for glory, or this quarrel over glory, in this week's discussion forum, so I'll leave the discussion until then. And so Hobbes goes on to say that the condition in the state of nature would be a condition of war. And Hobbes wants to be very clear here. In saying that the state of nature is a condition of war, he's not saying we'd be warring all the time. Again, we don't have to read Hobbes as more pessimistic or more unhopeful about human nature than he is. What he means by saying that the state of nature is a condition of war is that we can never be secure in thinking that there wouldn't be war. Right? There would always be factors sort of leading to the potential for war. He makes an analogy to weather, right? So when you say that Seattle is rainy, you don't mean that it's raining at each and every moment in Seattle. You mean that conditions are favorable for rain. And Hobbes thinks that in the state of nature, conditions would be favorable for war. Hobbes goes on to describe the state of nature in what is probably the most well-known passage of the Leviathan. In this condition of war, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Why would I work hard if you could just come and take away what I worked on? And consequently, no culture of the earth, no agriculture, no navigation, nor the use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force. So no building of big tools, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear, and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. If I were you, I would commit that phrase to memory. Not because I'm going to test you on it, but because it's something that learned people know. The life of man in Hobbes' state of nature: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And then Hobbes jumps in the next chapter, in chapter 14, to talking about rights and natural laws. By the right of nature, he means the liberty each man has to use his own power as he wants for the preservation of his own nature. Again, in our natural condition, we have a right essentially to anything that we can get our hands on and anything we desire. Hence the condition of war. And yet, he says, there are several laws of nature. And a law of nature, he says, is a rule found out by reason by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his own life, or take away the means of preserving the same, right? So we have a law of nature which says we are forbidden to do things that would be destructive to our own life or self-interest. And so Hobbes goes on to say, from this fundamental law of nature, we should be seeking peace. We just said that the natural condition is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, short. Reason tells us to seek peace. And Hobbes describes this. This is the second law of nature, that a man be willing, when others are too, as far forth as peace and defense, he shall think it necessary to lay down his right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. Right? Reason tells us that I should give up my right to everything if you're willing to give up your right to everything, so that we can seek peace and remove these causes of quarrel. And Hobbes goes on to enumerate several more laws of nature, which he thinks reason leads us to. The second question of this week's forum asks you to go back and revisit some of the laws of nature that Hobbes outlines in chapter 14. So I won't go through them all, but they're an impressive list. He's building an ethical system. He's building a system of justice whereby we can be led out of concern for our own self-preservation to peaceful interactions with others and eventually towards a state. Now, but there's one thing that you really have to keep in mind when Hobbes talks about these laws of nature. And this comes right at the end of the reading I gave you. This is on page 97. The laws of nature, Hobbes says, oblige in foro interno. That's Latin for in the internal forum. That is to say, they bind to a desire they should take place. But in foro externo, that is in the external forum, right, outside of our own thoughts. That is, to the putting them in act, these do not always bind. And here's the trick for Hobbes, and this is really where the Leviathan goes from here. Reason tells me that I should always want to abide by these laws of nature. However, reason also tells me that it would be foolish to do so under certain conditions. Namely, if other people are not willing to give up their right to everything, it would be foolish for me to give up my right to everything. So these are natural laws insofar as reason always wants these things, but reason itself cannot obligate us to follow them because we have different passions and desires. So the central political problem for Hobbes, the central ethical problem, is how to move from a condition in which we have these laws which we desire to follow, and to make it such that they are binding in the external forum, that they obligate us to actually act by them, to respect them, and to abide by them. Last but not least, there were several questions in the Salon about Hobbes' relationship to religion. Now, Hobbes' personal religious beliefs are notoriously difficult to parse. Many people take Hobbes for an atheist. There's one remark Hobbes makes in his writings that God might be a body, meaning that God might be some sort of material being that Hobbes may have some belief in, as opposed to a spiritual being, since Hobbes thinks all of our ideas are based in bodily things. And it's tough to figure out what that means. And there are times when he professes his preference for the Church of England. which may be sincere, may be politically motivated. It's very hard for us to tell. But he does say some things in chapter 12 of what we read that I think are worth paying attention to. Perhaps most notably, we get from Hobbes an indication that he sees most religion as having its origin, its natural origin, in fear, and oftentimes in superstition. But I want to note in this paragraph, it's very interesting that he doesn't throw out all religion. He says most religion results from this, from fear, but he says, but the acknowledging of one God, eternal, infinite, and omnipotent, may more easily be derived from the desire men have to know the causes of natural bodies and their several virtues, than from the fear of what was to befall them. For he that from any effect he sees come to pass should reason to the next and immediate cause, and from thence to the cause of that cause, and plunge himself profoundly in the pursuit of causes, shall at last come to this, that there must be one first cause, one first mover. That is a first and eternal cause of all things, which is that which men mean by the name God. So for Hobbes, certain philosophical conceptions of God are not based in fear. Reason may lead you to think that there is a first cause of all things, but importantly, again, we should not think that we have much of a conception of what that God is like. We see causation in our everyday world, we reason to a first cause, but we have no sense impression that could correspond to that first cause, so we really do not have a well-defined concept there. Another passage that I think is worth taking note of in chapter 12, because I think it may indicate somewhere of where Hobbes wants to go, is his remark about the Romans and what they tolerated in their societies. Note that he says, and therefore the Romans that had conquered the greatest part of the then known world made no scruple of tolerating any religion whatsoever in the city of Rome itself, unless it had something in it that could not consist with their civil government. So this is Hobbes' take on Gentile religions, that they were tolerant up to the point where your religion got in the way of your civil duty, and just keep that in mind as we go forward. So I guess what I'd say at this point is keep your eyes open as to what Hobbes has to say about religion. We see at times that he's quite critical of certain forms of religion, especially those based in the ambition of certain people trying to manipulate the fears of others. He's very critical of the Catholic Church, as we saw in the critique of transubstantiation. That critique will continue. But at other times, he seems open to certain forms of religion that will lead us to be more civically minded, maybe open to certain philosophical understandings of God. But one question that was asked in the Salon that I do want to mention is if Hobbes's relationship to religion is such an open question, why so much scriptural reference? And I would just say at this point, we'll see this a lot in many of the early modern thinkers we study. They're very good students of scripture. Whether they are using it to support their points or they are critiquing it in a certain way, they know the language of their day. And they know that they need to marshal scriptural support or offer certain reinterpretations of scripture if they're going to make people comfortable with their positions. Although what that means for his own personal faith or piety and what that will ultimately mean for his conception of toleration, we'll leave that an open question for now. So thanks. I hope this was helpful. If there's anything I have not answered yet, please let me know either on the discussion forum, through email, or through office hours. And keep working hard, and I hope you've enjoyed Hobbes.